Hi, I'm Jody Handley, Product Marketing Manager at GrapeCity Developer Solutions. Today we're talking with Wijmo JavaScript experts about web components and how Wijmo is going to be implementing them and what they are. We're here with Chris Bannon, Alex Ivanenko, and Bernardo de Castillo. So let's get started. First question, pretty basic. Bernardo, what are web components? Why are they useful for JavaScript developers? And what problem do they solve?
Oh, excellent question. So today you have HTML elements sitting here on the web page, and then you have some JavaScript code running over here. And the control that you're creating has to attach itself to that HTML element, which becomes a control host. So your control is kind of like a parasite. With web components, things change around, and your control can actually extend the HTML element class. So your control is no longer hosted in an HTML element. It is the HTML element. And that's great because, it simplifies the markup, and it simplifies the technology, and it integrates things better.
Great. So we currently have web components in Wijmo in beta. We're going to be releasing them at some point in the near future as a full release. What did it take for us to get the Wijmo controls into web components?
On the one hand, it was quite simple because we have very strong and powerful tools to implement and to jumpstart new interop. We used these tools for other interop that we created. On the other hand, we hit against some specific problems. For example, the one that Bernardo mentioned before, we had to rework the library to be inherited from the HTML element. It changed the way we initialize the components. So because native Wijmo controls uses host element to initialize it. Web components doesn't have it. This caused some problems that required some rework. Also, there were some specific problems with that HTML element itself already has a quite rich API, a number of methods and properties, and in some cases they coincided with the methods or properties that we already had in Wijmo controls. We had to address this problem too. So, but in general, it was more or less smooth process.
So you talked about interops. Of course, Wijmo is framework agnostic, and we have a lot of support for different frameworks. So I'm curious, how do web components work with frameworks?
With frameworks, web components gain a new power. In native implementation of web components, I mean that work in pure JS code, there is no declarative binding. And with frameworks, you get these bindings from the framework. Different frameworks have different level of support of web components. For example, Angular or Vue.js has a full-blown support, so you can bind to attributes, you can bind directly to properties. This is very important because we can bind complex objects. For example, we can bind an array to the flags grid item source property. This is very important. It's impossible if framework supports only binding to attributes. The third thing is event bindings, declarative event bindings. Some frameworks have some problems with it. For example, in React, it's currently impossible to declaratively bind to events. But from what I heard, React team promised to resolve this in the nearest future, so it's at the top of the to-do list. And so I think maybe in a month or two, all major frameworks will provide a full-blown support for web components.
Wow, that's soon.
I think yes.
Wow.
So if you think about what the components are, let's use FlexGrid for example, what it looks like to developers is instead of divs and JavaScript, you have actual WJ FlexGrid is the actual HTML element.
Yes.
And on that you can define properties
Yes.
and set them. But in web components you just can't add bindings
Yes.
to like a model.
Yes.
But in Angular, for example, you can.
Absolutely.
And that's where you can
Yes.
actually do data binding.
Yes.
I have another little question. So web components are just now really becoming a standard, but they've already been a concept for a long time in AngularJS, maybe even Knockout a long time ago. Do you think the frameworks have actually influenced the standard, or do you think the standard predates the frameworks and they were influenced by the standard?
I think that in the foreseeable future, this part of framework functionality, and usually the main part, specifically is binding. This will go out from frameworks, and frameworks will just use a native support of web components by browser, and will add only additional things like dependency injections, like routers, and so on. This stuff, this external stuff. And this is important to mention one thing. We talked about that there is no declarative binding in the standard. But in the web component standard. But there is a proposal. It was initiated by Apple, very well received by all the major browser vendors. Polymer team created a working functional polyfill that you can use right now, right today. Angular team actively participate in this work, and so I think that very soon this standard will be approved, will be natively supported by browsers, and in this case all this part of binding functionality will go out from frameworks, and they will just utilize this native support.
So it sounds like frameworks are going to probably evolve. Definitely going to evolve as a result of web components. So how is Wijmo going to be evolving as a result of web components? What are users going to get out of web components that they weren't necessarily able to get before with Wijmo controls?
I think that Wijmo, if to say about specific use cases, POJS users gives a possibility to declaratively use web components in HTML page, to declaratively define it. Framework users gets this possibility to add the bindings. With the time, I think that it will become possible for us to offer just a single interop, web components interop, that will work in all the frameworks. So we will not need to ship separate interrops for every framework like Angular, React, Vue, and so on. So the only we will need to do is only add some small pieces of framework-specific functionality, like, for example, flex grid cell templates or list box item templates that we can't implement now using native web components means. So what I see is that single interop with small additions of small extensions specific to the frameworks, instead of a lot of interop that we provide now.
So that's going to offer a lot more simplicity and ease of use. That's great.
Yes, and reuse.
Yes. Yeah, of course. So what, say I'm a developer and I want to get into web components, what should I be worrying about? What do I need to think about if I'm using them for the first time?
First of all, you should remember that not all the browsers currently natively support web components. So, for example, Firefox is about to proclaim that they support it, and now you can use web components there in the special experimental mode. HTML seems works on this, but it is not clear now. But we hope that it will be the support will be added there soon. In ES 11, we will never get the support because it's not an evergreen browser. But it's actually not a problem because with a couple of polyfills, you can force web components work in any browser, including IE. So it's not a problem. You just should be aware about this. That if you need to address all the range of major browsers, in some cases you will need to apply polyfills to this. The second problem is Shadow DOM. Web component standard encourage users to use Shadow DOM. So this allow a web components writer to hide that part of web component that actually implements its look, all the parts of it that user looks on the screen. So web components, from this point of view, ideal web component should look like a single element for any DOM API. So for DOM API, such an element doesn't include any child elements. It's the only element. This may be good, but this sometimes may be bad because this Shadow DOM doesn't allow user to a developer, a consumer of web component, to style this using outside global CSS. So global CSS doesn't penetrate to the shadow root, to the Shadow DOM. As I said, this may be good or may be bad. So, for example, Visual library is designed to be seriously styled using global CSS. So user may do a lot about styling Visual CSS. In case of Shadow DOM, it will be impossible. In Shadow DOM, with Shadow DOM, you just have an option to provide some so-called CSS variables. It's predefined set of variables that user can specify, and they can change, I don't know, things like background color, border, thickness, and so on. What I would worry about is that when you decide whether to add Shadow DOM or not, you should consider the fact that despite this seems like a must-have feature that should be a part of the web component implementation. In some cases, it's may work bad for you, and you may prefer to not use Shadow DOM.
So what we need to worry about mainly are polyfills for some older browsers or even newer browsers that aren't quite supporting it yet, and then the possibility of limited customization, that kind of thing, because of the Shadow DOM. Good things to know.
But that's something that applies to the current state of things, right? It's
Yes.
still an evolving standard. So the Shadow DOM styling thing, people
Yes.
are working on that. They're probably going to solve this because it is a clear problem, right? It really limits the usability of this feature. So I
So
think
when do
I
we-
expect to see this. I see this as a problem, and I expect to see it solved at some point.
So,
Yeah, I'm
Yeah, so along those lines, when do you think that web components are going to be more mainstream, that maybe the browsers are going to be solved, the Shadow DOM is going to be solved, all of these other issues?
Well, we already see them being used in some newer projects. So they're certainly ready for production use in some scenarios, especially when you can afford to target specific modern browsers, or if you don't have a problem depending on polyfills. But it's certainly not mainstream yet. Products like ours are just starting to add support, and we are seeing some interest with some pretty big customers of ours that are building internal component frameworks, and they want to leverage web components because they see the future too, like Alex does, where you're going to be able to build one set of components and use it in React, Angular, Vue, whatever you want. And it's obviously a much better investment if you build one set of components rather than a bunch of framework-specific components. So I would say over the next year, we'll probably see fairly mainstream adoption. It's hard to say, especially with things up in the air like the Shadow DOM. But yeah, I'd say pretty realistic over the next year.
So that's where we'd be seeing the mainstream piece of it, maybe some of these problems being resolved. Where do you see web components going in the future, their ultimate evolution? What would you like to see happen there?
I think that they should become, they should push out a bit frameworks. So they will implement most important part of the framework's functionality, the declarative addition of the components to the template, and bindings of several kinds, property bindings, event bindings, so on. So frameworks in future will use this as a base and add only some more high-level stuff to them.
And it's interesting to point out that the implication of that is also that your application becomes smaller.
Right.
Because
Which is
a lot of
extremely important
functionality
with
is
web.
already built
Yeah.
into the browser, so you
Yes.
don't need to download that framework, and you don't need to.
And I think
all that
it
code.
may also affect performance.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, that seems to be the modern browser pattern is they put out the low-level tools, they let developers, especially framework developers, experiment and kind of find the optimal usage and patterns, and then where it makes sense, the browser vendors say, oh, that makes sense in the browser itself, and we bring that into native support, like web components, bindings.
jQuery.
jQuery, yeah, query selector all came from jQuery.
No, but that's wonderful. You know that
Yeah.
they are tuned to the needs of the society, community of developers, and they respond. And they've been responding faster and faster. It used to take huge, super long cycles, and now we're seeing new features being rolled in gradually, very quickly, right? It has become even difficult to define what version of JavaScript you're using. You know, we're using 5.5. You know, it got some features of 6, but not all of them, which is a good thing.
It is. So how is Widmo going to evolve with the components?
So we plan to currently Widmo Web Components Interop is in the beta phase, and we plan to ship a release version of this in the nearest future. This will be a version that works without Shadow DOM. So, and next step is to add Shadow DOM support that can be, users will be able to switch between two modes. They will be able to work with Shadow DOM or without Shadow DOM. And we'll see on the feedback and think how we will evolve our interop in the future. So it's just a great test. We'll also keep track how the Shadow DOM standard itself is developed, because right now, as I said, it's not absolutely mature. So it it doesn't address the problem of deep customization of the internal part of the component. In case if component developer thinks that it should be possible and want to allow users to do it. So now Shadow DOM is quite closed. So this is the second thing. So this is.
But let me just try to summarize, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. What I'm seeing is that we're shipping Widmo 5, and we're adding the web components as an interop. And we think this interop is going to evolve over the next year and a half. But eventually, maybe 2 years from now, we're going to release Widmo 6. And that's won't have an interop anymore. It will be native web components throughout from the start. Right?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
that's the
yes,
idea.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is a,
And of course, we're going to keep shipping Widmo 5 in parallel with 6, because we realize that not everybody can migrate to the latest technology whenever they want to.
So it sounds like in the next few releases, then Shadow DOM is likely going to be the issue that we're going to be addressing, along with, of course, the full release.
Yeah, we're going to
of
be
the web
tracking the natural evolution of the standards and just trying to always stay on the cutting edge there.
Anything else that we'd like to share about web components with Widmo?
We just would really want to emphasize, while it's in its beta phase, is the time when we really need our customers to give it a try, and it's the best time to give feedback, because this is the time when we can make significant changes. Once we finally release it, we have to keep it stable. We can't make breaking changes all over the place. So we'd really love to hear feedback, especially surrounding the Shadow DOM topic. If people have opinions, we want to hear them. And just overall feedback of how our web components are used today. So I really hope we can get some people involved in this.
So, of course, you can get the download at the website, grapecity.com, and you can also find the forums there if you have any questions. I'm sure that the feedback can also be offered there. Again, I'm Jody Handley, Product Marketing Manager at GrapeCity. Thanks so much for listening to our talk about web components today, and you can find more videos at the YouTube channel. Thanks.